This podcast is a production of the Cable Podcast Network.
In the pines, where the sun never shines, you'll shiver when the cold wind blows. There's a grave in the pines, where the sun never shines. There's a grave that's shaded with the pines.
It was June 16, 1774. It was a Thursday, nearly 100 miles south of the Ohio River in the vast unexplored interior of Virginia's Fincastle County. A small group of permanent buildings was being raised not far from the Kentucky River, close to the east bank of the Salt River. It was the first settlement of whites ever to be established in the Kentucky lands, and the leader of the party, toward the close of the day, eyed his men's handiwork and nodded approvingly. "I've always dreamed of establishing a town and naming it after myself," he said. "I therefore name this settlement Harrisburg." At practically the same time, on the west fork of the Monongahela River, half a thousand miles away, the Mingo chief Logan expertly removed the glossy raven-black scalp from the buckskin-clad white man lying dead at his feet. It was the 13th scalp he had personally taken since the murder of his family, but his vengeance was yet far from sated. The white man had never heard the shot that sent a lead ball crashing through his spine at the base of his neck, and because of his solitary habits, he was not apt to be missed for a long time. His name was David Duncan.
That's a great excerpt from The Frontiersman by Alan W. Eckert. Welcome back to our podcast, The Land Between the Meadows, A History of Kentucky. In this episode, we're going to talk about early exploration, and we're going to talk about the first contacts from Native Americans with white settlers. So, Mr. Pope, let's get a little more background here.
Whenever we start talking about exploration of Kentucky or the discovery of America or the finding of Kentucky, I have to smile to myself because, from a Native American perspective, it's almost offensive to say, oh, the discovery of America, when the Native Americans, as we've talked about, have been here for, 15 or 20,000 years. So when we begin talking about this history of Kentucky, we're really talking about a European perspective, from a European person's viewpoint. The land that we know as Kentucky, really the credit goes to the French, who in 1679, Robert La Salle went down the Mississippi River to the Ohio and claimed this area. We can go back a little further, though, because there were 3 different European countries that claimed Kentucky at this time. One was Spain, France, and of course England. The Spanish laid their claim back in 1494, shortly after Columbus discovered America, when the Pope, the Catholic Pope, set up what he called the line of demarcation, and that divided the world into 3 parts, and North America was given totally to Spain. Spain, to make a short history, claimed Florida and explored Florida. And Florida included Georgia, South Carolina, and Kentucky. And that was what Florida meant to Spain. So Spain had a claim on Kentucky, and perhaps even the first claim. But the really credit that goes for Kentucky were the French. Robert La Salle, he led a series of trips from Canada. As you know, the French came into North America through the St. Lawrence Seaway and made trading posts and forts around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, and their main interest was trading furs. La Salle discovered the Mississippi River, and thus the French claimed the Mississippi River and all of its tributaries for France. Well, the tributaries included the Ohio River, and the Ohio River, in its watershed, was Kentucky. And if you follow the Ohio River up, it runs into western Pennsylvania, what is now Pittsburgh. So you can see when you go to the English in the 13 colonies that there's a problem here. Because as Pennsylvania and the westward expansion towards the Appalachian of the English begins to happen, they begin to run into the French, who have claimed the same area.
I'm glad you say that, Mr. Pope. This really clears up a misconception that I've had, and I'm sure others have had, because when you think of Kentucky's history, you think of, well, Daniel Boone, the English. It's as simple as that, but there's other people who have laid claim, obviously the Native Americans, but you're looking at, French and Spain. I had no clue that they even, they technically at one point claimed Kentucky or had some sort of influence in Kentucky. Immediately go to the English and the settlers or the colonies coming over the mountains.
Yes, exactly. And in 1750, before the French and Indian War, the King of England authorized Dr. Thomas Walker to explore this area over the Appalachian Mountains. And Dr. Thomas Walker and I think 4 men found Cumberland Gap, which was also the Wilderness Trail, and into Kentucky. And so he named Cumberland Gap, the Cumberland Mountains, the Cumberland River, all after the Duke of Cumberland. And he went as far as Barbersville, and he built kind of a trapper's cabin there and spent a winter. And when he came back, he reported to the king that Kentucky was not a very good place, that it was rugged, it was rough, it was, not really a great place of interest to explore or to even live in. So that was his perspective on it. But he did name Cumberland Gap after the Duke of Cumberland and the Cumberland Mountains and the Cumberland River. And that was in 1750. Oddly enough, when we talk about the first Europeans or the first English people in Kentucky, both of them were captives. The first English man was Gabriel Arthur in 1674, and he was taken here against his will. And, he was captured by the Shawnee Indians and was taken to Kentucky. And the first English woman to ever enter Kentucky was Mary Ingalls in 1755. And you can guess what? She was captured by the Shawnee too in Draper Valley, Virginia, and brought to what is now Big Bone Lick. She and a Dutch woman, where they lived and finally escaped from the Native Americans, from the Shawnee. And it's a great book, another great book, Follow the River, that tells of her episode of escaping in the late fall of the year and trying to, without food or shelter, without any weapons, making their way back to Virginia. The Dutch woman went crazy along the way and had to be abandoned. They slept at night under piles of leaves to stay warm. They ate acorns and nuts. They were so starved that some of their teeth fell out of their mouth. They waded frozen streams and rivers, and they followed the Ohio River back up into the mountains of West Virginia and Virginia to make their way back home. But, when you have two countries going back to England and France, that claim the same territory, George Washington went over the mountains and told the French to leave their fort, he had some Indian allies with him, and they started a fight and killed a bunch of French, and that touched off the French and Indian War. So you can really kind of say that George Washington started the French and Indian War. He screwed up. He was totally out of control with the Indians. That was the result, the cause and effect relationship there. The French and Indian War. Go ahead.
First contact with the Native Americans. Is that, do we know?
The first contact with them
being
like, they were prisoners, but the Shawnee had been raiding over the mountains, and other Indian tribes had all up and down the colonies. I mean, the Pilgrims had wars with different various tribes of the Native Americans, and, in North Carolina, Tennessee, they were all very fearful. Virginia, I mean, even Jamestown had, a war. When they had the Jamestown colonies with Native Americans, they were nearly wiped out. So this had been going on for some time. It's all about the Europeans coming into land that's owned by Indians, and it's a struggle for resources, food.
Yeah. You said that George Washington attacked the fort of the French. What was the French
didn't really
fort?
attack. He was carrying a message from Lord Dunmore to get out, that this was British territory. And he had I don't know whether it was 40 or 50 Indian allies that went with him. back through the woods of Pennsylvania. And when they got there, they started hostilities and killed a bunch of French rather than just delivering the message. And
yeah.
They kind of hacked things off.
Where was that located in Pennsylvania, or do we know?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I forget the name of it.
Yeah.
One of the things we talk, many people say, well, who had the better claim to Kentucky? People that came in and settled and lived on the land. Why didn't the French, bring colonies along the Ohio River and into Kentucky? Mm-hmm. And there's two main reasons. The French were very smart. They knew that the Shawnee claimed that area, and they didn't want to mess with the Shawnee because they were afraid of them. Yeah. And the second reason is that furs found in Kentucky were inferior to furs from Canada and the Great Lakes.
Okay.
And money was all about furs. Yeah. That's all. Furs were big bucks.
They were completely happy with staying in the north
Absolutely.
And gathering the resources there.
And the French and the English were a little different too, in that the French established these trading posts, and the Indians really liked the French because the French were very fair. They traded, guns, metal items, pots, trinkets, whatever that the Indians really needed. Mm-hmm. So this changed the culture of a lot of Indian tribes in North America that were in contact with the French, because instead of being these hunter-gatherer farmers, they became fur trappers. Yeah. Because the things they needed, they got from the French.
And so the French wanted furs.
And the French wanted furs. They were making money off of them. So it was a very good relationship. The English, on the other hand, were into settling, farming, clearing the forests, the resources, occupying the land.
Yeah, taking the land.
And the Indians didn't like that. So when the French and Indian War broke out, you can imagine who most of the Indian tribes
were for the French.
Yeah. That's why we call it the French and Indian War, because it was the English, which is the colonists, against the French and the Indians. Yeah. And that happened in 1754.
And now you said, too, that George Washington went in with some Native Americans. So, who was on
the English had some Indian allies too, and particularly that joined them late in the war. Yeah. The Indians, some of the tribes were very smart because they wanted to kind of see how the war went. Imagine if you were an Indian tribe and you decided to become allies with the losing one,
what was going to happen
many of them did with the French, because the French seceded the land in North America east of the Mississippi River. And the Indians that were there, it was like, okay, you're not our friends. You've been helping the French. So it was a problem. It's kind of interesting in that when the British came, they sent a lot of resources, troops and money and everything. It really bankrupt. The French and Indian War actually bankrupt Britain. Yeah. And these Englishmen were used to European fighting, so they lined up in open fields. And the French and the Indians fought with Indian tactics behind trees. And they just annihilated the British in the first part of this war, until the colonists kind of came in and got involved, and they fought like Indians because they'd been used to fighting the Indians, and they defeated the French. So the English won the French and Indian War. France gave up all claims for Kentucky, and so did Spain. They didn't want to deal with it. They didn't want to deal with it.
So you said that at the first of the war, British sent in their own army.
They did.
And that was their whole...
Oh, they did. They hated the French. They never got along with them. And, it's interesting. There's so much we can say about this because of the French... The Revolutionary War was a result of the French and Indian War. Because the British believed that they had spent so much money and troops in defending the colonies that they felt the colonies owed the British money.
Indebted
for
life.
So what did they do? They started taxing them. Yeah. Taxation without representation. And that caused the break between the colonies and made the birth of our country. But it was all related to the French and Indian War.
And now, another point, did those troops that were here fighting the French and Indian War, did they leave as soon as it was over, or did they end up kind of staying around?
I think some probably stayed around and some went back because it was a massive amount. Yeah. Especially, and they were brought back again, of course, in the Revolutionary War after they went back to England because of the uprisings and so forth. The only problem that the Native Americans had was, like the Shawnee, is that, okay, France gives up all their claims for Kentucky, and so did Spain. Yeah. But the Shawnee didn't. Oh, they said, "This is our land. We don't care what. We don't really. War. Yeah, we really don't
care what war you won or anything."
Yes, my son Dr. Justin Pope, who's a professor, said that the French and Indian War actually became a world war because there were so many European countries involved in it and allies and so forth.
Yeah.
So it was actually historically the First World War.
Wow, that's very true.
In the proclamation of 1763, King George III said, okay, we want to just trade with the Indians, we don't want to settle. So no Englishmen are allowed to cross over the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky.
Yeah.
Well, that's a little bit of a problem because the king, as we said, in Britain was bankrupt. They couldn't pay the colonists who enlisted to fight, and so they gave them land in Kentucky for fighting in the French and Indian War.
Then said,
and then the king turned around and said, you can't go in there.
Yeah.
So this didn't settle well with a lot of people. They said no one could cross over the Appalachian Mountains. He wanted no more wars with the Indians, and he wanted to keep the valuable fur trade going.
Yeah.
Land east of the mountains was crowded. So this is, you can see, we're setting up for a big thing. They promised them land for fighting. From the Appalachian Mountains to the eastern coast of the Atlantic Ocean was becoming crowded. Farmland was, scarce as far as more and more Europeans were arriving.
And you think, well, it's not that populated. How can it be so crowded? But yet people need farmlands to sustain their lives, their family lives. So it's getting crowded, even though the people aren't it's not a huge metropolis, but it's getting overcrowded. And where else are they going to go?
Absolutely. And the colonists also knew that, as we talked about in our second podcast, that no Indians lived in Kentucky. So it was very tempting to think, well, I can go over the mountains, slip in there, trap furs, get, beaver pelts, whatever, and come back and make a fortune.
Yes, and no one will even know that, Native Americans aren't there, they're not living there. It'll be an easy thing. Let's pause real quick, and we'll come right back.
Okay.
Welcome back. We're going to conclude our podcast on early exploration with that final thought there, but we're going to kind of talk a little bit what we got up next. What's coming next, Mr. Pope, as far as settlers in Kentucky?
Yeah, I've been wondering that too. There's a lot of directions we can go in, but one that I think would really interest us are the major forts in Kentucky. Talking about Fort Herod, our first fort, Fort Logan, and of course Boonesboro. And I would like to really focus, just to make it a little more interesting, on the siege of Boonesboro, the famous attack on Boonesboro and Daniel Boone and so forth. So I'd like to kind of talk about that in depth rather than just in general about Kentucky stations and forts.
Well, I find it interesting too because you name those forts, Harrisburg, Logan, and Boonesboro, and they are in pretty close proximity to each other when you look at the geographic layout of Kentucky.
They really are. And, when we talk about the regions of Kentucky, that plays so much into history, no matter where you are, the land. We're talking about the bluegrass. We're talking about the outskirts of the bluegrass. All of them are kind of surrounded on the edge of the knobs in the bluegrass.
Before we go, though, we did have a question from a listener. And the question was, we talked in the first episode about mounds and the mound builders, the primitive time in Kentucky. And the question was, how can you tell where a mound is if you're, can you spot the mound? Can you spot out that's a mound over there in the field? Or how can you figure out, how do you determine if it's a mound? Okay,
that's a really good question. Most of them, there were lots of mounds all over, especially central Kentucky. And, southern Ohio, the Serpentine Mounds, the mounds, Cahokia in Illinois. This whole region had lots of mounds. The bluegrass had lots of mounds. Most of them have been destroyed and not preserved. So when you say you can see mounds, it's mainly knowing where they were, and they were very common. To know if a mound is a mound would really require architectural research. You need to go in and see, is there a campsite there or a village site? You might even have to excavate it. Obviously, mounds were small humps, maybe only 2 feet tall to maybe 30 or 40 feet tall. So, they're different size mounds, and some villages had more than one mound. Most villages did. And many of the mounds were used for burial grounds, so you'd have to excavate, and that needs to be done professionally by the University of Kentucky to determine, the history and to record it and so forth. So mounds are kind of like artifacts in that Well, you might have a mound out in a field, and it may just be a piece of earth that's raised up, or it may have been made by man. And the definition of an artifact, if you have a stone, let's say, you might have one stone in one hand and one in the other. Well, one of them may be an artifact and the other's not. Well, what's the difference? Well, an artifact is something that was made or used by humans, and the other one may just be a rock. And it's the same way when you're talking about mounds. You'd have to explore a little bit more, but usually mounds were close to water, and they were in village sites. They didn't just make them out in the middle of nowhere. So there's going to be archaeological evidence around them of some type that substantiates. And also, if you dug them up, many of them being burial grounds, you would find artifacts and bones and so forth.
So, I mean, in short, you're not going to be able to necessarily drive around in your car and say, oh, look, there's a mound over there. It's more or less knowing where they were.
That's correct.
If you have a knowledge of, hey, I know where, I've looked at these old history books, these, if I've researched it and I know where these mounds are located, then in that nature you can say, well, I know there's mounds over in that field over there because, that's where I read that at some point.
Yes, that's correct.
You can't really just spot them out by the naked eye and be like, oh, that's a mound right there.
Most of the time not.
Yeah. It's got to be a little more research.
I know some areas in Montgomery County where I can drive down the road and I can see Native American mounds.
Yes, okay.
Driving down the road.
And and you know that because you know that.
I know that,
it's not a trick of the eye or anything.
No, it's not.
So if you have any other questions, any questions at all, you want to shoot Mr. Pope or...
Don't shoot me.
I probably can't answer any of them, but contact us through Facebook or me on Twitter at CableDad5, and again contact us on Facebook and let us know what you're thinking or what you would like us maybe to talk more about. There's plenty of history out there, and as we said, our next one we kind of want to focus a little bit more in depth on Boonesboro, the Battle of Boonesboro. So if there's anything you want us to get more in depth on, just let us know. All right.
History is so exciting.
It is.
Mr. Cable, and I just love talking about it and sharing with other people and discovering things myself. I learn as I go along, and that's part of it.
It is. All right. Once again, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
If you would like to join the conversation and give your thoughts on this podcast and other episodes, join the Cable Podcast Network group on Facebook. If you're enjoying the content of this podcast and would like to support it, visit anchor.fm/The Meadows Kentucky History/support. You can also find this link in the show's description. If you want to help our podcast grow in other ways, like the Cable Podcast Network page on Facebook and share our links on all social media outlets. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, give us a positive review and leave a comment. Thanks for all your support.